So the purpose of our time is, first of all, to be together. You know, we've been participating in this remarkable information and inspiring content that's been flowing to us the last hour and a half or so. And now it's a chance for us to hear and be with each other. So we want to explore some information, and we have some very remarkable experts with us in the next to give us some information. We want to engage with one another. We want to hear your goals and your aspirations for this idea of music education ecosystems. And we also want to explore and then define what are some of the skills, attributes, and capacities that we need as people and as organizations to actually achieve this work. David?
So with that, as Mary said, we've got one part that'll be some presentation, and that's really about some baseline information about participation and funding in music education. The second half hour, then we're actually going to break into small randomized groups and really have a time to talk and really think about our call to action questions and responses to that. And then a final 15 minutes really reflecting on what we've said, both individually and aggregate, and really thinking about the personal skills and mindsets to address the challenge and opportunity before us. So let's get started. And for our first presenter this afternoon, it's my pleasure to welcome Bob Morrison to discuss his work building statewide data systems that help to define equity and access to the arts. Bob is the Chief Executive Officer of Quadrant Research, the Director of ArtsEd New Jersey, and the Executive Director of the newly formed Center for Arts Education and Social Emotional Learning. A miraculous feat since he holds all three positions simultaneously. Bob, good afternoon and welcome.
Hey, good afternoon, David, and good afternoon, everyone. Before I begin, I just wanted to add my thanks to the class of 1957 for their continued support of this work. It was such a pleasure to meet several of them 4 years ago when we gathered on the Yale campus all in person. I'm going to start today by asking one simple question to get us started, and that is, what does data have to do with equity as it relates to arts education? And I would argue that it has everything to do with it. You see, for decades, we've had school leaders and politicians who have all made the same claim. They've all said this, that music education is a right for all students. Whenever we've pushed them, whenever we talk to them, they would say, oh, it's for every child. It's for all students. It's for every student. But oftentimes, what we failed to do is to hold them accountable. And we've failed to do the most fundamental thing in holding them accountable in their statements, and that is to count. Simple as that. We haven't counted. The idea that how do we know if we are reaching all students if we don't even bother to count? And that really is the fundamental question behind a lot of this work. Now, my data journey began in 1988 with this question. How many schools have instrumental music programs? And much to my amazement, nobody knew. Nobody had any idea. None of the national organizations, not the Department of Education, not NAFME or what was then MENC, nobody could tell me how many schools had music programs. And this has really guided my work, because from there, it really led my journey to address some of these questions regarding how many students have access. How many schools are offering music programs? How many teachers are there? In which arts disciplines are they available? What arts courses? Who has access? Who does not? And how does any of this change over time? Well, that led us to do our first report, which was called The Sound of Silence back in 2004. And the response was so overwhelming that it let us know that we were onto something. And so we started doing additional reports in dozens of other states. And those reports were basically done by surveying individual schools. And over the next decade, we come to realize that there were data that were living inside of state systems across the country with state departments of education. And as a result, it told us that the information existed, but the states lacked the funding or the capacity to leverage the data. And that led us to the creation of the Arts Education Data Project. Now, the Arts Education Data Project is a consortium partnership between the State Education Agency Directors of Arts Education and Quadrant Research, with significant support coming from our national funders, including the CMA Foundation, the Music Man Foundation, the Ohio Arts Council, the William and Florette Hewlett Foundation, and of course, one of our first funders was the NAMM Foundation. And the background to the project was pretty simple. We are focused on working with existing data that we acquire from state departments of education. We're not doing new data creation. We're not doing surveying. We're extracting data from departments of education. And this process was developed over the past 17 years, working with various federal and state agencies. We are currently operating in 20 states, representing 59% of all students, with an additional 11 states currently in development for this year. And what's important to understand is that the data is not the end. The data is a means to an end. And that end is to increase access to and participation in music and arts education for all students across the nation. When we started back in 2017, we started with 4 states, California, Wisconsin, Ohio, and North Carolina. Currently, by the end of this year, we'll be in 31 states representing 74% of all students, with the goal by the end of 2022 to be in 45 states representing 98% of all students. Now, underlying this is a modern data architecture that cost about $500,000 to build in order to manage the billions and billions of data elements that are extracted from the states in order to create these systems. And so what I'd like to do now is just show you one particular state. And what I'm going to do is we're going to take a look at the state of Delaware. And this is the data project for the state of Delaware. And basically what we have is some different data elements that I'll walk you through. Across the top here is the what we call key performance indicators. So the number of schools, the school enrollment, the number of students that are enrolled in the arts, the percentage of students that are enrolled in the arts, and the number of students that don't have access to any arts instruction. In the state of Delaware, every student has the opportunity to participate in the arts. We then look at across the all arts level to see the student and arts or student and school access, access to the state policy or the state requirements, participation based on free and reduced lunch, participation based on school configuration. Then we get to the discipline level where you're looking at, okay, percentage of students in music, visual art, theater, dance, or other, which includes media arts. And then you can hover over to see what the grade band enrollment is for each of those areas. The final data element that we look at is course level enrollment. So here you're seeing the general courses that are available in each of the arts discipline, and their height is based on the number of students that are participating. And you can toggle that to look at the number of schools that are providing the information as well. In addition, you can click on the help button and it will give you an overlay that will show you the information that you may have questions about on how to interact with them. And you can also filter the data using a variety of different filters to get a look down to the county level, school district level, and what have you. A couple other dashboards I want to share with you include, you can look at the information by discipline. So what does music education look like in the state of Delaware? And this shows you highlighted by county, then gives you the course enrollment, tells you the number of students and the number of teachers and the student-teacher ratio for music. And then at the very bottom, we'll show you the number of students enrolled by the grade configuration, gender breakdown, as well as participation based on free and reduced lunch. And you can scroll through and look at any of the individual arts disciplines, theater, dance, or visual art as part of this. Another way to look at the data is what we call a district view. So here, again, you have the map of all the districts in the state of Delaware, and then we're looking at participation based on the majority race ethnicity of the school. So not based on race ethnic participation, but the majority race ethnicity of the school. And you can see how it varies between the various race ethnicities within across the state. We also then have the same information, but based on free and reduced lunch configuration. And then at the bottom, show you the number of schools that are offering each of the arts disciplines, student enrollment, number of courses, number of teachers in those areas. And you can filter this information down to get to the individual district just by clicking on a district. And now all the information has been recalibrated, and you can see the data and compare it based on the ghosted data elements for the statewide averages for each of those categories. Two other things real quickly. We have trends over time that will show you how the data has changed over time, including arts enrollment, which you can see from 2020 to 2021 that there was a decline from 74% student participation to 69.1% student participation. And this is the first state in the nation that is reporting data as a result of the current COVID 2021 school year. So trends over time allows us to then look at how are things changing for free and reduced lunch, how are things changing for race, ethnicity. Here I can point out that the majority of schools in Delaware where race is Hispanic, they have a higher participation rate than any other race, ethnicity area in the state. Lastly, we have a school profile that will allow you to go down to an individual school level to see what does participation levels look like in each of the disciplines at the school, what is the participation by grade level, what did it look like over the last 5 years, what courses were available over the last 5 years, and then you can then look at course enrollment for any of the courses that are available for that particular school district. So that was a quick run through the state of Delaware just to give you a sample. That's a small sample of the information that's available to you. But what's important right now is that we've been hit by this little critter, and the little critter is the COVID-19 pandemic. And as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic, we did a new dashboard for Delaware to look at the impact of COVID. And I'm just going to give you some quick highlights of what we found there because it's an early indicator of what we may be seeing in other states. So here we see, again, they went from 74% enrollment down to 69%. And when we look to do a guided analysis for what is this telling us, it shows us that on the number of arts courses that they're pretty similar. You know, they're down 3 arts courses year over year, but their enrollment came down significantly, 7.8% decline, a significant decline. We haven't seen declines in any state like that prior to 2021. But when we look at music, it's actually down 9.2%. And then when we look at the music courses to see where was enrollment up and where was enrollment down, for all music across the state, all grade levels, you can begin to see where the declines are. 66% in strings, 48% in vocal music, 38% in general band. But when we look at the elementary level, you can see the significant decline across the board of the foundational music courses in the state of Delaware at the elementary level, which obviously raises questions. So what does that mean for the future as we move forward? So this is really important information that we have because now, as the data demonstrates, it's going to be critical to understanding the national impact of COVID-19 and the impact across all demographic areas, but even more so in reporting on the recovery in 2022, 2023, and 2024. How do we emerge from the pandemic? We know what's happened as a result of it, but how do we move forward? And then just real quickly, because of that, I'm going to give you a sneak peek at something that we're working on that will be out in a year, and that is this guy. This is a map of music education at the high school level across the country. We're beginning to fill it in now, but a year from now, we will have the majority of states represented, and you'll be able to look at this map for music or all arts or dance or theater or visual art, along with by race, ethnicity, and other factors. So this will give us the first national view of the status and condition of arts education in our country. And before turning it back to David, I just want to leave you with one final thought. A dear friend of mine and my mentor, Sir Ken Robinson, told me in 2004 when I shared that first California report with him, he said, "You know, Bob, without data, you're just another person with an opinion." And in the work that we're doing, we need to use data as our superpower as we work to rebuild our programs as a result of COVID-19, but actually expand them into this, what I believe will be a new renaissance for music and arts education across this country. So, David, back to you.
Thanks, Bob. It's not David, it's Mary. We did a last minute switch, but thank you so much. Be sure that now that you're done in the very speedy and very important, be sure you put all your referenced websites in the chat so folks can get right at it. And very interesting and important work. So thank you once again, my friend. If you've been listening at all to the world in education, you know that the federal education relief funds that was also referenced by Deputy Secretary Martin in our earlier remarks is really significant, and we thought we needed to take a little time to share with you from expert analysis of what truly is going to be available to school districts everywhere. So I'm delighted to have with us from the Education Commission on the States, Chris Duncombe and Claus van Zastrow, and they're going to give us a quick overview of our education relief funds. To you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Barry. I'm seeing that my camera is on, so that's good news. So I'd really like to thank you for inviting me to do this. I'm also delighted to be here with my colleague, Chris Duncombe, to talk about demographics and the future of music education. I'm Claus van Zastrow. I'm a principal at Education Commission of the States, and we are a nonpartisan national education policy organization that serves 50 states and the District of Columbia, and we run the gamut of education issues from early learning all the way into post-secondary in the workforce. And we do this by providing research, by publishing reports, by hosting convenings, and generally providing counsel to state leaders across the country. And I should add that we are the organization that administers the Arts Education Partnership, of which the National Association of Music Merchants is a valued partner. So I'm really going to address very quickly, I'm afraid, 4 big trends here. The first of these is the baby bust, so falling birth rates. The second is the impact of growing racial and ethnic diversity and persistent inequity. The third is the growth in the share of English learners, and the fourth is the impact of growing economic need. And basically, it seems, well, I've rushed ahead, I didn't mean to. It seems that these trends ultimately, as the bottom line here, suggests that groups of students who have traditionally lacked opportunities to engage in music are growing as a share of the population. And so, the pandemic has even worsened the need of many of these groups who have traditionally not had the same opportunities. So it's not clear that the kinds of resources people have to address these needs will grow in proportion to the need. And so that's one of the most urgent concerns we have. So I'll begin with the baby bust. So the number of births in this country peaked around 2007, but then after that point, there was a very steep decline, and so much so that the CDC reported, I think just last month, that the birth rate fell to its lowest rate in over 40 years. And in fact, the pandemic is probably going to exacerbate that, because the CDC report compared December 19 birth rates to December 20 birth rates and found that there was an 8% decline. Now that is enormous, and that's a harbinger, like a sign of what's going to probably come next year. Now, declining birth rates can, of course, contribute to declining enrollments down the road, and that has implications, of course, for school budgets. So let's see what's happened with enrollments. We had a fairly steady increase in enrollments between 1980 and 2018, but current projections show that that will pretty much level off until 2029. Now, immigration may be offsetting declining birth rates, but we can't count on that to happen forever, because those students who were born, the first ones born in the pandemic, are going to be in elementary school in 2029, and a lot of these jolts to the system that we're seeing could have real impact on enrollment. Now, the pandemic itself caused a substantial decline in enrollments that was even separate from birth rates. Now, 2% might not seem like a lot, but in fact, it really has a lot of meaning and can have a lot of impact on schools. Homeschooling was part of what drove this, and many of the students, or at least some of the students who have been homeschooled for the past year, may not be coming back to public schools in the following year. So arts facilities and instruction costs will be much harder to sustain with per pupil funding that's tied to smaller enrollments. So now let's talk a bit about growing economic and ethnic diversity in US schools and persistent inequities. So students of color continue on average to have fewer opportunities in arts education nationally, and they face larger barriers even as they make up a larger share of school enrollments. Now, Bob's data presentation has shown that that really varies from state to state, and I think his data are going to be so valuable because you can really look at that state in local context. But nationally, there have been concerning data for quite some time. Now, nationally, I see that, did my screen stop sharing? So I'm going to try to share my screen again. I'm so sorry. It seems to have stopped sharing. Bear with me for just a second here. So nationally, it stopped making sense in 2013 to divide students into majority and minority. So from 2000 to 2018, we saw that enrollment among white students dropped precipitously. So if you look at that gray line that was just drawn across the screen, you'll see that white students made up less than half of all students starting around 2018. Now, Black and African-American students declined slightly over the same period, but Latinx students rose as a share of enrollment pretty sharply over that same period as well. And if we look at projections, we see that white students are projected to decline as a share of enrollment, whereas Black or African-American and Latinx students are meant to be pretty much stable for the coming years. Now, you can here have a quick overview of what's happening with some other racial and ethnic groups. We see that both Asian American students and students who identify as being of two or more races remained a small portion of school enrollments, but they're growing pretty fast. Now, American Indian and Pacific Islander students, by contrast, have made up 1% or less of all school enrollments. And as a result, they often escape notice and don't show up in data systems. And this can be a real challenge that we have to address as a nation, because very often if they're too small a sample, we don't know what's happening. Work like the work that Bob is doing in all of these states, however, gives us the whole universe of data because he's using state data systems and can actually address this challenge. So what I've tried to do is look at the most recent national data and the kind of access that students have had to music education opportunities. And so I've not had a lot of time to present today, so I'm only going to look at one indicator, and that is how often students are playing instruments in schools. It's not a perfect indicator, but I think it'll give us something of a proxy to see what has been happening. So as we look at this one indicator, we see that there were significant, statistically significant differences by race and ethnicity. And again, we see that American Indian or Alaska Native students, we don't have any data there, unfortunately, because the samples were too small. So now let's look at English learners who are also growing as a share of student enrollments. So we see that enrollments that I mentioned before have not grown very rapidly in the last 18 years. But if we look at the enrollments among English learners, we see that in fact, their enrollments have grown by 32% over the same time, so much more quickly. These students as well have been traditionally less likely as a whole nationally to be playing instruments in school regularly at least once a week. And again, this is our proxy for access to opportunity. We see here a statistically significant difference among the two groups. Now let's finally look at students who are in low income families. Even before the pandemic, a growing share of students came from families with low incomes. And one way we measure this is we determine the share of students who are eligible for free lunch or subsidized lunch with the National School Lunch Program. And so between the fall of 2000 and the fall of 2018, we see that the share of students who are eligible for school lunch were actually much, much higher at the end than the beginning. So more than half of students now are eligible for free or reduced price lunch. And the pandemic may in fact have worsened this, may have lasting consequences for the students. So this chart from the Opportunity Insights Economic Tracker examines the change in jobs since January 2020. And so we see that among those people who have earned more than $60,000 a year, their jobs have been fairly stable. In fact, they've even gained ground after a dip right at the beginning of the pandemic. The second group, who earned between $27,000 and $60,000 a year, only did somewhat worse, but that group that earned less than $27,000 a year has suffered much worse job losses on average. And so this can have lasting impact. It can have lasting impact on those families and on the students who themselves have been those to receive free and reduced price lunch. And so here we see that students who qualify for free or subsidized lunch are again less likely to play instruments in class at least once a week, So we see there's a statistically significant difference there, and that these inequities, in fact, that may exist outside of school often are exacerbated inside of school. This is one reason why data like the data that Bob is presenting are so critical to equity. Now, the big challenge here being, of course, that even as need grows, the capacity of the nation to address that need might not grow at the same rate. And so I'm going to pass things to my colleague, Chris, right now, who will talk a bit about different kinds of funding structures nationally that can address this problem. Chris?
Thank you, Claus, and thank you for having me here today. Claus highlighted changes in student populations across the US. I'm really going to discuss and focus in on recent changes to school budgets. And since the pandemic began, schools have undergone a really rapid transformation, scaling up distance learning, renovating and retrofitting facilities, and now starting to implement programs for accelerating student learning. And this transition has happened in a time of financial uncertainty. There's been fluctuations in student enrollment, as Claus highlighted, as well as in state and local revenue projections. And that's created a lot of budgetary challenges. ECS has a summary on some of the funding responses states have taken, and I'll share that at the end of the presentation, but my focus today is on the federal relief. So to assist schools in managing these crises, the federal government provided a historic infusion of resources to states and local school districts. Across the 3 relief packages approved since last March, there'll be approximately $190 billion in aid going to states, districts, and charters in that main pot of funding available for K-12 education called the Elementary and Secondary School Emergency Relief Fund, or ESSER. And to put that in a little bit more context, on a per student basis, if you combine ESSER 1, 2, and 3, that's about $3,741 per student. And for some additional perspective, if you were to combine all those ESSER funds, they represent about 1/4 of total pre-pandemic spending in 2019 from all sources, from state, local, and federal. So this is truly a historic investment of federal resources. Going on to timeline, states and districts will have more than 1 year to spend the funds. The ESSER funds are going from the federal government to states, specifically the state education agency, and the SEA is required to subgrant at least 90% of funds to local school districts based on their federal Title 1A share. And then the local district can choose to use those funds for eligible services, which I'll get into in a bit later. So a big question for folks here listening in is whether these dollars can support music education on the arts. And going on to the next slide, you'll see that the answer is yes. ESSER funds may be used for a wide range of activities to address the needs arising from the pandemic. And that includes any activity authorized by the Elementary and Secondary School Education Act, Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, Adult Ed and Family Literacy, Perkins Career and Technical Education, along with 13 specific services. And I've listed out a few of them on this slide. But as it relates to music and the arts, NAFME, the National Association for Music Education, has identified allowable ESSER expenses to support music education. And this includes training for socially distanced music instruction, mass and bell covers for instruments, and for accelerating student learning through after-school or summer learning programs. And you can follow NAFME on Twitter for more ideas. They're tweeting out examples of how schools can use ESSER funds to support music educations for all eligible uses. On the next slide, we have this is a tweet here that has an example of a bell cover on a trombone. Another example on the next slide is providing music education to students with unique learning needs, such as students with a disability, or on the next slide, mitigation strategies. And this is research that came from the International Performing Arts Coalition. So as these spending decisions are being made by state and local leaders, which is happening right now, it's important that they hear from diverse perspectives, including the music and arts community, as they're making these decisions. It is a part of the American Rescue Plan requires that state and local school districts seek broad public input. And states must incorporate stakeholder engagement in their ESSER plan that was due back in June 7th to receive the last third of the ARP ESSER funds. And while that date has passed, it does not mean that states are done planning. In fact, many states have requested extensions for submitting their plans. Only 29 states and DC submitted by that deadline. And states and districts continue to receive input after the submission of their plan. Going forward, and going forward one more slide, Washington State, for example, has committed in their plan to continuing public engagement through a survey that will go on through the summer. As you'll see in this slide, they have their survey open through the end of August on how they'll use ARP funds for learning recovery and learning acceleration. And another example, Iowa has conducted an initial statewide survey for developing their plan, and they'll be following that up with surveys and focus groups. And it's not just at the state level that you can engage. LEAs, local education agencies, are also required to have public input into their ESSER plans. And on this slide, I have an example of Waukegan Public Schools just north of the city of Chicago, and they have their survey out in both English and Spanish that's available through June 25th. And so you can identify how you can engage with the state or district by going to the state education agency website or local school district website, or following them on social media. Many states and districts are advertising this option for public input through their social media platforms. So in summary, this is a historic investment of federal resources that is available and can support music education and arts. State and local leaders are determining how these funds will be allocated right now. You can speak up on behalf of music education and the arts by going to your SEA or local district website. And I've also included a few other details that we will distribute the slide with some links that will be available on some resources that the Education Commission of the States has put out. And that includes that bottom item, K-12 funding policy responses to COVID-19, if you're more interested in state actions that have been taken. So on behalf of ECS, I want to thank you for inviting us to participate today. And as a reminder, as Claus mentioned, in addition to school finance, ECS policy staff are tracking state action in over 60 issue areas. So please reach out with any questions if you have, or if you need additional resources, and we'd be happy to help. So thank you all for your time.
Thank you so much, Chris and Claus. Once again, you've taken some very complex and important information and compressed it and also made it understandable to all of us. And thanks to Bob Morrison too. Concerning funding for music education, I'd like to alert you to a study funded by the NAMM Foundation that's just summarized at the partner page, the NAMM Foundation partner page here at the event platform. The true cost of music education in a study of 10 disparate school districts and their investments in music education, both across the K-12 spectrum, per capita spend, the difference between school district dollars and separate fundraising dollars. And we really encourage you to pursue that at your leisure.